Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Emma. Ngā mihi nui koe. I'm just going to talk for a while we get all our panellists kitted up with their headset mics and seated. And I'm going to talk about music. It was music that brought me to Auckland, and music that, often as not, has told me what kind of Aucklander I am. My first taste was in 1982, my second year out of school, when my mates and I, having driven from Christchurch to the Sweetwaters Festival, carried on north afterwards. And the funny thing was, we knew where to go. We knew to go to Sounds Unlimited at the bottom of Queen Street for the import records. We knew to go to the Logan Campbell Centre to see the Clash play. That was exciting. And we also knew to go to Ponsonby, where we knocked at the front door of those famous wastrels, the Androids, and were invited in for that famous recreational substance, a cup of tea. We knew that because we read Rip It Up, and music was basically what we knew about Auckland. Simon, you're here. A year later, I moved here to live, and I think for a lot of us, music brought us to Auckland. And to work as the deputy editor of Rip It Up, Main Street, the Glue Pot, the Windsor, the scruffy houses where I lived and partied with musicians, the Rip It Up office itself, up 3 flights of stairs in Derby Street. There's a towering bank tower there now, and pretty much everywhere else is now gone or altered beyond recognition. Then I went to London for 5 years, and in 1991, when I came back, I really thought, and I kind of dreaded it, I thought I'd be returning to a monoculture. But music was playing its part in changing the inner city's face. The children of Pacific immigrants were coming in from the south and the west, into the bohemian delights of K Road, and to a new kind of nightclub around High Street. And in the years that followed, I was a DJ, a magazine editor, a BFM broadcaster. In some way, music always seemed to have a role in who I was in Auckland. And in various ways, that's true of everyone you'll hear from tonight. Simon Grigg has been at the centre of Auckland's musical history since, inspired by a childhood meeting with legendary Auckland promoter and manager Phil Warren. He assembled and managed the city's first punk rock group, the Suburban Reptiles, in 1977. He went on to form the city's first indie record label, Propeller, and ran its most famous nightclubs, The Box and Cause Celeb. And then something really big happened. He signed Paulie Fuimana to his record label, and they released the global hit How Bizarre. A story told in his new book, How Bizarre, Paulie Fuimana and the Song That Stormed the World. The book will be published by Our Press later this month, and tonight will be the first time Simon discusses it. Having read the book, I can tell you there is plenty to discuss. I would also note that Simon is creative director of the music heritage website AudioCulture, the source of most of the images you've seen in the venue tonight. AudioCulture.co.nz, great website. Moving on, in her work as a TV storyteller, Rachel Lang has long used music to establish time, place, and atmosphere in Auckland. Before Cheryl West had said a word in Outrageous Fortune, well, actually, if you remember the beginning of Outrageous Fortune, Cheryl wasn't actually talking. She was doing something else that she did quite a lot in that series. But before we heard any of that, Gutter Black told us so much about who and where the Wests were. Now, more recently in Westside, Rachel and her co-creator James Griffin gave music an even greater role in marking out the compass points not only of their story, but our shared geography and history. Next panellist, Philip Bell, aka DJ Sir Vere, has been a DJ since he stepped up to the turntables at the age of 14 when his dad needed a toilet break, and hip-hop has been his musical life since he saw the movie Beat Street at the Civic at the age of 17. He ran Auckland's first 12-hour dance party, Planet Rock, in 1988, and founded BFM's long-running True School hip-hop show. Also, the huge Major Flavours hip-hop compilation franchise and the Beat Merchant Store, the centre of Auckland's hip-hop scene. He's been the editor of Rip It Up magazine and is currently the program director at My FM, the station that found an Auckland audience the rest had ignored. and he's worked with everyone from Shefu to Savage. He's the Don Dada, as they say. And last but certainly not least, Dave Dobbyn. Dave was born in the working class Auckland suburb of Glen Innes and got his musical education from the sounds around him, the Irish songs in the home, the singing in the church over the road, and the tunes on the radio. He joined a band and he grew up to write the songs of the city and sometimes to play the artist as social critic in works like Madeleine Avenue. For more than 20 years, he has lived in Grey Lynn, which, according to APRA's figures, is still the national capital of songwriting, which makes Dave honorary president or something. You happy with being president?
Oh,
is that senior enough, Dave? At the conclusion of tonight's discussion, Dave will be playing for us here. We said, Dave, can you play 3 songs? And he said, how about 4? Okay, he's Dave Dobbyn. And then after that, you're warmly invited to join us down in Taku Tamaki, Auckland Stories, where Phil will be playing some records in tribute to Auckland nightlife in our pop-up nightclub. That was quite fun. I like that idea. It wouldn't be a proper nightclub down there without a drink, and I'm happy to say that you can take a drink down with you. If you want to do that, please take the goods lift at the back, which will deposit you directly there. The drinks thing, it was major. We pretty much had to go to the ministerial level, but we've also cleared it for you to have a bit of a dance as well, if you like that. But you can't smoke anywhere in the building, even for old time's sake. And I know you want to. The rest of the exhibition will also remain open, and you can access that via the atrium downstairs. Drinks and delicious food will be available anytime during the talk and throughout Dave's set. The moment Dave finishes, the kitchen closes, so get in there. The toilets are over there at the back, and in case of emergency, follow your crew. They know what to do. So, let's begin. We have everyone here. I'm going to go with you, Simon, because you were supposed to be sitting here.
We can swap if you want.
No, it's all right. I want to start with this, your parents arranging a meeting with Phil Warren, who, for people who don't know, was a legendary nightclub owner and promoter and manager and record label guy and everything else, who actually also became a city councillor. He was a remarkable figure. But Simon, that meeting, it almost sounds too good to be true. It's like the kind of thing that Rachel would write at the start of a story. How did it happen, and what advice did Phil offer you?
I had long wanted to be in the music industry, and I realised that I had no musical talent. My guitar teacher told me to go away. I was insulting the instrument, and I was still fascinated by the industry. I wanted to be involved somehow in making records. And I had an earlier meeting with a guy called Alan Galbraith, who my mother had arranged. Alan Galbraith was a record producer who produced Space Waltz, Mark Williams, a whole raft of classic New Zealand records. And that hadn't really gone anywhere. He was a nice guy, and we still talk about it, but Mum was a little bit frustrated, I think, by the fact that I was sitting around the house moping. I was at university doing a law degree. I wasn't happy about doing a law degree or the law intermediate. And so she rang up Phil Warren. Phil Warren was the most obvious person to ring up, I think. He was on television all the time. He was Mr. Entertainment in Auckland, in New Zealand, in fact. He ran a whole chain of nightclubs and managed people from Ray Columbus through to the Chicks, through, you name it, he managed them. And so she rang up Phil Warren in the phone book and said, my son
these are amazingly supportive parents.
My son wants to be in the music industry. And Phil Warren, Phil being as he was, Phil was always a very open sort of guy. He said, send him in. So I went into this office in Cook Street. There's a nightclub called Stringfellows at that stage. It was later the Ace of Clubs, upstairs from where Cook Street Market was. And there was this vast office and these huge purple and orange vinyl sofas. And all around the wall, these pictures of Phil Warren with people like Shirley Bassey. There were superstars around the wall, and I sat there, and he was behind this massive desk. And he said to me, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to make music. And he said, well, go and make it. And I said, well, but surely, it's more to that. He said, no, just do it. Just go out there and do it. Come up with an idea. Don't let anybody tell you that it's not going to work, because people will, and go and make music.
That's almost a punk rock way of thinking about it. I mean, can you draw a line between that meeting and 2 years later becoming the manager of the Suburban Reptiles?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can. We sat around for a while, friends of mine at university, and talked about what we wanted to do. And I had a friend called Brett Salter, who was later in the Suburban Reptiles, and we sort of brainstormed a jazz band. And he had a saxophone, he couldn't play it. I was a manager who couldn't manage. And so we thought we'd form a band. It seemed like the logical thing to do. So we came up with this, we got a name first, I think it was called Froggy Morton and the Reptiles. But that's all it was. And
but was that an exciting time? Did it feel like Auckland had changed when those arty punks emerged?
Well, we were going to do this jazz band, then we read about something in the NME. The NMEs used to arrive 3 or 4 months after they came out in the UK. There was a little thing in page 43 of the NME talking about this band called the Sex Pistols. And my very good friend David Blythe looked at this thing. We were sitting around our flat. He looked at this ad and he said, "Don't form a jazz band, form a punk band." I thought, well, that's a bloody good idea. So I went around to see Jimmy and said, "We're not forming a jazz band, we're forming a punk band." Mm. And so the Suburban Reptiles were formed that day. Wow. We still couldn't play.
No. But I remember being very excited when I saw the Suburban Reptiles on Ready to Roll, and especially excited by Zero and her tight top. Rachel, you're kind of an imposter here in that you're not only Wellingtonian, you manage the 6 Volt, who, that's like having a BA in being Wellingtonian, isn't it?
Certainly is,
Yes.
yeah.
So what was your first experience of Auckland music?
Ooh, that's kind of, I think that music is really a formative young person's experience, and I arrived in Auckland at around 30. So I was kind of past it by the time I got here. So a lot of my Auckland experience of music has been through writing TV shows, because TV shows and music are inextricably linked.
I don't think they are for everyone, though. I think you and some of the people you work with have made that so. Would you agree?
Yeah. We've certainly tried to use New Zealand music, partly because it helps express the world that our characters live in. I actually found that interesting researching, I guess, in a way, for this panel this evening, looking at the things I'd made and the music I'd used and how different it was for each show, which I found really interesting because it was about a different world, even from the theme songs for each show. When I first moved to Auckland, I was kind of drifting around, and then I got this job. Someone called me up and asked me to work on this soap, and I went, And it was called Shortland Street, and it became all-consuming. And I still remember the terrible theme song, which is on to this day, and I still am haunted by the lyrics. Is it you or is it me? Lately, I've been lost, it seems. I think a change is what I need. If you're looking for a chance or a dream, Shortland Street. It makes no sense.
Genius. Genius.
And yet, I would have to say, I actually wrote the AudioCulture entry for Songs of Shortland Street, and it's one of the most popular things that's ever gone on the site. You know, and especially things, I mean, Joey, when he burned, Joey the Psycho burned a building down, and he was a Battle to Space fan. So, yeah, he did it to Battle. I mean, did your characters, you know, in the character Bible, which is the...
Oh, actually, on Shortland Street...
Do they always have...
Actually, no, they don't always, but I do remember in the early days of Shortland Street that the Verlaines were referenced quite heavily because Guy Warner was a big Dunedin fan. But that was because of the writers and who we were, because we were all immersed in New Zealand music culture. But as things went on and I was working on other shows, it was an absolute pleasure and delight for us to be able to showcase New Zealand music. And I remember Mercy Peak, which is the first 1-hour show that I did, had heaps of New Zealand music in it. And in fact, we used it, Shouldn't You Ought to Be in Love? We asked you very specially to let us reversion that.
Yes.
Yeah, in an episode, and there was a whole episode that was written around White Valiant, and I have somewhere my slavish fan letter to Don McGlashan going, could you please let us use this? But yeah, we were all very keen on music and keen on the interface between what we were doing and what we could do for musicians as well. We were inspired by the music, but also we could put it on the tally and give the musicians a few dollars and maybe get New Zealand audiences to listen to it.
And I must say, I know a few musicians who were excited both by the payday and by being on television. So you've done good things there. Phil, you're a Waikato boy, but you had your turning point in Auckland, didn't you? Tell me about seeing Beat Street at the Civic.
Yeah, I am from Hamilton, so I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Auckland City, only in the sense that I'm a rugby fan as well, so it's an ongoing problem forever. But I have lived here most of my life, and for us, music was more of a necessity than like something we aspired to do. Because I lived in, they say the end of the railway tracks, so I lived in Papakura. So it was the longest trip you could possibly take to come into the city. And way back in the days when breakdancing first started to happen, even though it was somewhat comical, it was actually really necessary because it was somewhere for us to migrate to, hang out with, without getting into bucket loads of trouble. Because otherwise, if you take that away, we were just literally getting into trouble all the time. I wasn't a problem kid, but all the friends I hang out with most certainly were.
You've always been the responsible one,
Yeah,
actually.
I wasn't really starting it.
You're just saying that for your mum.
I'm just getting involved. I was getting involved in it. I just wasn't starting it. And then, but Beat Street was a real pivotal moment in time because we couldn't really afford to go to the movies. And not because we were poor, we just didn't have that much income left to do things like that. But then when that movie came out, the enticing part of it was just the aesthetic of hip-hop in general, because prior to that, because I lived in Papakura, so it was either Bob Marley or it was Bob Marley. That's where it stopped.
I mean, that was an American movie about an American culture. Did it occur to you at the time that this could be a local culture?
No. And I think that early on, not so much now, but early on, I think that hip-hop has this aesthetic to it. And we didn't go, oh, I want to dress like that, or I want to dance like that. We didn't really think that. You just kind of adapted it because you were already dancing, or you may have been doing some form of art. Being Māori, I was obviously surrounded by artists, whether they be making things out of wood or carving, whatever. So it was just when you saw the movie, it all made sense. People often say, oh, you represent this American art form. I'm like, yeah, that's true, but there is absolutely no doubt that you could never make a damn native song in America. It's not possible. Or make a How Bizarre. You have to make it in New Zealand. So that's why when people challenge me, and it happens a lot, people are like, oh, American art form. Yeah, it's American art form. So is line dancing. And people don't go, oh, people don't really do that. Like heavy metal was, I don't necessarily think right at the beginning it was a New Zealand art form, no. But we certainly adapted it and gave that our own thing. That's what the movie was. It was like this trigger, and then it just sort of went from there. But it was
so how did it emerge locally? When did you first become aware that there was such a thing as New Zealand hip-hop?
The first moment, I believe, especially for Aucklanders, because if I thought there was really no issue with Hamilton and Auckland, but there definitely was with Wellington, 100%. Yeah. No doubt about it. Like that kind of, in a weird sort of way, it kind of still exists. 10 years ago, it was 100% there. We would tour down there and people were like, oh, we're not coming to your show. You're not welcome here, that kind of shit. Excuse me. But Apart Posse released a record. Prior to that, it was Through the Hard Way, and that was like nice. But Apart Posse from Wellington they were the first one to release probably the first rap record, and then everyone in Auckland was instantly offended. Like that, it's a defining moment. We were watching Radio with Pictures, and we're like, what the hell is that? We're in Auckland, we're supposed to be doing everything first. Yeah. That was the moment that, from there, it just took off. Yeah. That was the moment.
And Dave, what was the music around you when you were growing up? You grew up in Glen Innes, which was and still is to some extent, a hard working class suburb. What were your influences? What did you hear?
Well, it's a kind of a mixture, really. I mean, definitely a lot of, obviously, church music. I lived across the road from the primary school, a Catholic primary school I grew up in. So we had a lot of Pacific music coming across the paddock. So all the choirs from the, from the Pākehā singing Latin to, Samoan, just lots of choral music really. And our neighbours played endless Elvis, including all the gospel stuff, which was pretty hard to take back then. And just all of that, mingled with lawnmowers, Hendrix, Cream, you name it. At the age of 11, I went to Sacred Heart College, and my first instant friend was Ian Morris, who I ended up forming a band with years later called The Dudes. But he and I were obsessed with tape machines and how the Beatles recorded and, the Rolling Stones. And he would get, because he came out at the age of 9 from England, he would get NMEs and Melody Makers 6 months later, because that's how long it took for the ships to come out. And so we had this steady stream of music coming through that blew my mind. And a lot of it was American music, but via the UK back then.
It's interesting. I think that's the case for a lot of us.
For a lot of us
Yeah.
at my age, I'm 58, so a lot of the stuff wasn't directly from America. It came via the UK. We were very much UK influenced, and so we had all that. But then, in hindsight, on reflection, there was a lot of American music coming through places like Invercargill, Dunedin, which had an enormous amount of American music coming through, because Dunedin was the hub of Radio New Zealand for a long time. For some reason, Radio New Zealand was really big in Dunedin, and a lot of stuff would be, disseminated through there. And because of New Zealanders, post-war New Zealanders marrying Americans and stuff, there was a lot of incredible, and all the R&R that happened through the post-World War II, plus Korea and everything, all the R&R trips that all the Americans would do, all the servicemen would do, the navies and everything, all this American music came in.
And you've got a similar story in Christchurch as well, because
Yeah.
because
Deep Freeze.
the Operation Deep Freeze base was
Yeah,
there.
exactly. And of course, I think still to this day there's an enormous amount of vinyl floating around that was sourced in those places, because and that's where it all came from historically. And so that mixed with what we were getting from the UK was phenomenal. And locally speaking, we had, of course, the usual, TV programs with, you'd be looking at and there'd be some hair band, Think or Father Time or, Human Instinct were one of my favourites back in the day. And, we'd go into town to watch movies, and we'd stop at Britomart, hop off the rattly old Daimler buses, and there on the corner at a place called Levi's, there'd be a band called Ticket playing, and it was all kind of fusion,
And Ian Morris said that the band that really made your band, the Dudes, come together was Hello Sailor. And
Yeah,
he
definitely.
talked about the peculiarly Auckland sound they created. How would you characterise that sound?
Well, it's actually really interesting. I mean, apart from the fact that, being just young and idealistic, and we looked up to them because they were actually a real band that lived like a rock and roll band. They weren't just a pretend rock and roll band. They didn't have a residency anywhere. They weren't pretend. They toured, and they played our favourite gig, which was the Windsor Castle in Parnell, which was an entirely different suburb back in those days. And then, so it was our aspiration was, if we play the Windsor Castle Hotel, we'd made it, back then. And as far as we're concerned, we did. But the thing that was peculiar about Hello Sailor was that they managed to sort of, because of a combination of great songs and great grooves, they had this Rolling Stones thing on the one hand, and then this kind of Otis Redding thing on another, this soul thing on another, but also this kind of Latin thing on another. Mm. So it was a real weird mixture and a meeting. It was South, but there was something deeply South Pacific about it. even though it was Pākehā ostensibly, it was deeply South Pacific music as far as we could hear. And that was something that we could aspire to. And the fact was the quality of the songs made all the difference to us, and the quality of performance made all the difference to us. They had great values in terms of production, and they had a real manager, and, you know, there was a kind of a vibe about them. There was that magic, I hate to use the word X, because it's a brand now, but there was this magic thing about them that you know, that translated directly to a good time, an unencumbered, fully abandoned good time. And so it was a purity of rock and roll. It wasn't sort of old hat rock and roll. It wasn't that kind of, you know, shonky managers and shonky venues, and, you know, it just didn't smell like, you know, pretend rock and roll. It smelt real. And there was always some controversy around them. There were you know, cowboy stories, drugs, Mandrake Mansion, all that kind of stuff. And this is all very attractive stuff to a, you know, to a 19-year-old or an 18-year-old kid playing guitar, who, you know. And we knew we could play, and we knew we could get better, and we knew what to head for in terms of that kind of expertise. And, you know, a very mystical thing, but they kind of encapsulated that. So it was something to head for, you know.
And of course, Simon, the other thing that was happening at the Windsor Castle, at pretty much the same time as Dave was excited about playing there, that was where the punks went. I mean, it's hard to believe. I mean, you also managed Taste Records in Parnell. It's hard to imagine Parnell having a record shop. Yeah. But, I mean, what was that scene like? Because there are some amazing pictures on AudioCulture that Sarah Lee Lewis took, and they're extraordinary. I mean, what was that like?
Parnell was kind of punk central for a while. All the cool flats were in Parnell. There were, every Birdwood Crescent where I lived, there were 2 flats together, which were full of all sorts of sort of strange and interesting sort of people. And there were other places in St George's Bay Road and, you know, all around that area. It was a real hub of what was going on. And there was the Windsor Castle, which is run by the Lanes, these brothers, and they also owned the Exchange across the road. And they seemed to have a far more open policy towards rock and roll than anybody else in the city. The glue pot existed, but the glue pot was very, very staid at that stage. It was for a long, long time. And a lot of the punk bands just couldn't get in there. It wasn't until 81 that Toy Love managed to get into the place, I think. And then Mike Dooley was told to take his boots off. He had to play in bare feet. So all of a sudden this venue turned up. It had been a rock and roll venue for a while, and my brother-in-law, Larry, and his girlfriend, then wife, my sister, Fiona, were booking the place. And they started to put Saturday afternoons on at the Windsor Castle. So they put $1 on the door and put punk bands on. And all of a sudden, on Saturday afternoons, Parnell turned into this like heaving sort of, it wasn't Parnell as we know it now.
It was great. It was really great.
It was fantastic, wasn't it?
Yeah, I first saw the Enemy there. And
extraordinary
Chris was
gigs.
Carving up his arms, there was blood everywhere and people pogoing all over the place. And then Toy Love would play there, and we'd often share the bill, which was very odd, you know, a bunch of Ponzi rockers.
But in a way, you guys made it possible as well, the dudes playing there. I know you were slightly sort of, for want of a better word, a little more conservative than the punk bands.
Yes, exactly.
And there was always a divide there between the two, but there was also an empathy as well.
Yeah, well, we got on really well.
Yeah,
they
I think
were nice
so.
people.
And you were brave enough to play Zwines too.
It was really great. We would play there. I got to tell you the economics of it just briefly. We would play 4 sets a night from Wednesdays to Saturdays including. So what's that, 4 nights a week? 4 sets a night of 45 minutes. It was $1 on the door to go in. A jug was $2. So you had a ball, you know. Everyone had a ball.
If you got there before 6 o'clock, you got them free.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. And on Saturdays, who knows. But 4 sets a night, 4 nights a week. We supplied the PA, did all our own posters, paid for everything else. And at the end of the week, the Lane brothers would kindly give us $500 before tax.
Tax?
Tax? Oh, yes.
Did it
We
feel
didn't
like
know what that
Auckland
word meant.
was changing at that time? Because if you look at the pictures of those kids, as they were kids, at the Windsor, that they looked like lost children who'd come from nowhere.
Yeah.
We were talking about this downstairs, was it upstairs or downstairs, wherever we were talking about it. There was, between 1974 and 77, there was this major change in Auckland. Before that, you had interesting things. You had split ends who were fascinating. They were like these people from another planet, basically, who didn't quite know whether they were a glam band, a prog rock band, or whatever. And they were fantastic, and they inspired a lot of the changes that came afterwards. But before that, it was all very, very conservative, and people wrote songs about being in love. And then the punk new wave thing came along, and it wasn't just the punk bands, it was bands like Hello Sailor who were part of the same sort of ethos, weren't they? And you guys as well. It was rock and roll.
Yeah. We just wanted freedom.
Yeah.
It was so stifling living in those
It happened
days.
around
If you
the
went to
world.
the dairy on a Sunday, you couldn't buy toothpaste. It would be covered up. And I used to work in a grocery store, and you used to have to put the Medessas into a paper bag to hide them, the sanitary pads. But stuff was covered up. You couldn't buy
The
it.
record shop I was working in Parnell on Saturdays was the only record shop open in Auckland, because Parnell had a special tourist dispensation to be allowed to open on Saturdays. So the shop was called Professor Longhair's, which explains the era it came from. But we kind of took it over and turned it into a punk shop. So Saturday mornings, up the road, you had this whole thing. They started at midday or 1 o'clock, I think, and we were open to 1 o'clock. And so the punks would come in, buy their singles, do all that sort of stuff, then go up the road and go and see bands. It was kind of this perfect marriage of...
Rachel, I have to ask you about, in the first series of West Side, one of the great moments and one of the best episodes of the first season is the visit to the other heart of punk rock in Auckland's Wines. Whose idea was that? Because it was a great piece of writing. It basically it set everything in time and place.
I have to admit that James is the biggest music nerd ever, and he really should be here instead of me. I'm a pretender. But the amazing thing for both of us was revisiting the 70s, because if you don't know, West Side is a 6-episode show it's a prequel to Outrageous Fortune about Ted West and his gang. It's set in West Auckland, but it starts in 1974 and goes to 1979. So one of the great things for me and James, who were both teenagers from Hawke's Bay at about that time, was revisiting that period in terms of music. And James did a lot of the research, and one of his major obsessions was making sure that Gutter Black was featured, that the fake truth about Gutter Black was realised in 1977, and the other thing he was fascinated with was punk and Zwines. And also what we were delighted to find, because we weren't there at the time, was that Zwines was on one side of the road and there was a Polynesian disco place called Babes on the other side. And they were actually in direct proximity to each other.
Babes was underneath Swines.
Right, so they were in the same spot. So actually a lot of the fun of that show was exploring the music, and actually the shock of that show was also exploring, because I remember in 1974 coming here from Britain and being horrified by the music, because to me it just seemed so old-fashioned and there seemed to be so little of it. And I remember very particular things from 1974, 75, which was Space Waltz. And Yesterday was just the beginning of my life, which James has made me promise not to sing to you, because I love that song. But just there was so little at that point, and by the as Simon was saying, by the time you get to 1979, there's just so much music, and just this explosion of culture, almost an explosion of frustration in this country. That things were changing so remarkably. It's amazing. It's absolutely incredible. And so we had a lot to choose from by the time we got 79, whereas we had quite a limited palette in 74, which in some ways suited the story we were telling, because, A really big song from 1974 was Joined Together by Steve Allen.
I've got
the
that on,
Commonwealth Games song.
I've got that on 7-inch.
And it's a terrible song.
It is.
But in a way, you have to celebrate how far things moved. And that was kind of half the fun.
Phil, I don't want to leave you out of all us baby boomers talking about punk rock in the middle of Auckland. I mean, what was your musical experience, in the late 70s? What were there punk rockers at your school?
Yeah, of course there were. Yeah. In fact, it's indicative of bad brains that punks and reggae fans live together. It was the heavy metalers, they were the problem. So whenever those two groups of people would occupy the same space. So ironically, my son is in Westside. He's the young wolf for the 2 years. So when I watched that show, and at the age that Rion supposedly is, I kind of grew up through that era. So when these guys are talking about this era was when I was a child. So because I always wanted to go wherever he was. So Simon was that guy who was occupying the spaces that I always wanted to go to. So
Even this early, you?
Yeah, because my father is a musician. He performed on Stars on Sunday. So I am pretty old. So he performed on Stars on Sunday. He was in a band from Hamilton, and my cousin Dylan, his dad is the same. So as we grew up in the industry. So I was on set for a bunch of TV shows that everyone would be playing on, and I thought the lifestyle was pretty awesome, but I was just a kid. So my dad used to play in the malls. We'd hang out at the malls like a roadie, which is in turn how it turned into what it became for me. But all these songs, they all occupied the same space. It's funny when you talk about Saturday shopping, because my father later became a DJ after he'd given up singing. So we would go, when Saturday shopping came along, that was the day to go get the records to use at the disco on the weekend. So again, I was just occupying the same space, biding my time, waiting for my time to come. As far as punk rock goes, I was actually in a punk rock band in Papakura, but it was so incredibly terrible.
What were they called?
I think that was the whole idea, though, wasn't it?
We didn't have a name.
They should be on AudioCulture.
They didn't have a name, but then one of the guys in the band became really good, and he turned into a band called D Still, which actually was quite good. But we were so awful that even our group of friends that we performed to in Drury, in the shed, told us to just, that's enough. That'll do.
So what was the geography of it? Did you ever come into town, or was that still...
Yeah, so like these guys, we would talk about NME. NME was the lifeline of everything. So NME was... So I would spend all my money on records and anything to do with music. So NME, I was doing the same thing. I was ordering it weekly. But I don't know how I ever afforded it, because it wasn't exactly cheap. Because it was air freighted.
Yeah,
right? It was not cheap.
Several pounds.
So I remember going into the store going, I can't really pay for it, so I might steal some money from here. We'll do the rounds of the milk run, take the milk bottles, and then go down to the shop. It's terrible. But I did what I had to do, because then I'd go to the back, in the NME.
Wait,
in the back,
we had Rion stealing milk money in 1974.
I think we all lost our innocence.
75.
I'd like to see, I would love to see what date. I'm sure there's a date somewhere where New Zealand's innocence was utterly lost. When the milk money was exchanged for tokens, because nobody was trusted.
Yes.
I used to make a killing. I was a paper boy. Hey!
And then one day you turn up to the milk bottles and you what is this?
Oh man, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
take it down to the newsagents.
What's going on now? Yeah, the dairies would complain after that, because they had a huge, suddenly jellied snakes weren't happening anymore. Nobody could afford them.
Oh, you could always collect bottles and go take them back to the deposit.
That's true. That's true.
You never did it in your own neighbourhood either. You never did that.
No.
But anyway, in the back of NME, there was a list of records you could buy. And then later in Rip It Up became our NME, because Rip It Up, in the back of it, had Sounds Unlimited, which was on, there was 2 spots on Queen Street and the Record Warehouse, where the Rip It Up office was. So that that was my weekly trip into town. So on Friday after school, get everything done I need to, catch a bus and go record shopping, come home. That was a staple.
Well, I have to say that, similar to your experience with the NME, my first copy of Rip It Up, I left the shop with it, and I wasn't quite sure whether I was stealing it or not. But 2 years later, I was working for them, so
yeah.
Simon.
Sorry, my phone.
you moved on
Slammed.
from that punk era to actually starting a record label, which was kind of a punk thing to do. And it was in that year, 1981, which is...
Well, 1980 actually, but yeah, 81 was our golden year, class of 81,
This is
Scream,
Propeller
Memes,
Records.
Blam, 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 all that sort of stuff. But we did it because we had to do it. We didn't really have a choice. There were so many bands that were out there. With the punk explosion, and especially after Toy Love, The Enemy and Toy Love had come to Auckland, they, like you were saying before about we were Aucklanders and we're supposed to do it better, these guys from Dunedin turned up and completely revolutionised everything.
Yeah.
And so there was this whole change in the way things were done. People wanted to make records. Toy Love were one of the first to make records. They wanted to record their own songs. They wanted to do all that sort of stuff. And the major record companies didn't want to know. And I was flatting in Parnell, in one of those flats I was talking about before, with a member of the Features. James is over there somewhere. And the Features were great. They were fantastic. I loved them. And I said, we should make a record. And we thought, that's a great idea. So I went to Polygram and said, we want to make a record. And they just laughed at me. And so I thought, well, I might as well do it myself then. So we formed a record label. We did it. And Brian Staff, at the same time, had just released AK-79. It was almost simultaneous. And so I went to Brian and I said, Brian, how do I do this? How do I get a record pressed? And there's this guy you go and see and you slip him some money and he'll send the masters down to Wellington. So we did it. And we released the records and they sold. And all of a sudden there was like this independent record industry overnight. And it wasn't just me and Brian. There was a raft of labels that started up. Some only lasted 2 or 3 records, but all of a sudden you could do it. You didn't need the big record companies to take control of this whole thing. And you had record shops that were keen to support this as well. So I think that was kind of the beginnings of the New Zealand recording industry as we know it now.
And actually, the other thing, and this was true of Flying Nun, which came on the heels of what you did, was that suddenly it was acceptable to make your own music video as well. You made your own record sleeves and posters, and you made your own music video, which is my way of segueing into tonight's first exclusive. We've got a couple of things that you won't have heard before. And Otis, are we ready? Excellent. Tell us about the video we're about to see.
Well, we're talking about the Features before, and that was the first single on Propeller Records. And there was a video made at the time, and it was, as it was, we made our own videos, it was rough and ready. And earlier this year, Jed, who was the guitarist, vocalist, songwriter with the band, basically made a new video from the old parts of the video, re-edited, regraded, all that sort of stuff, and we have a brand new video for this incredible song.
And I think the extraordinary thing is it shows an Auckland CBD that doesn't actually exist
This is an
anymore.
Auckland City song.
Yeah. It's called City Scenes. Roll tape, Otis.
I see the people walking, I never hear them talking.
Who spotted Simon in the record shop? Who saw the trolley bus? Yeah, pretty interesting, eh? I mentioned 1981 before, which was the year after that was made, and I want to focus on that year because it's turned out to be a really interesting year for music and for Auckland music in particular. And this year's APRA Silver Scrolls is the 50th anniversary of that award. And they've made the decision to award the so-called Lost Scroll, because for some reason in 1981, which was a fairly interesting year for the country, there was no Silver Scroll awarded. And a short list of nominees has been drawn up, two of which were on Simon's label, No Depression in New Zealand by Blam 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 and See Me Go by the Screaming Mimes. Rachel, West Side has been funded for a second series.
Yep.
And the music for that's going to be really interesting because the whole thing is set in 1981, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. For various reasons, we decided to skip 1980 and go straight to 1981. But yeah, I've got the list here of the other Silver Scrolls because I was talking about it with my children the other day, and they knew all of them and regarded them all as classics. Counting the Beat, The Swingers, No Depression in New Zealand, One Step Ahead, Split Ends, See Me Go, Screaming Mimes, and Tally Ho, The Clean. But then that actually started us as a family, gosh, we're nerdy, talking about other songs from 1981. And for me particularly, it was just such well, for a lot of us, it was an amazing year, wasn't it? We were all quite busy, we got quite fit in Wellington, whether you were in Wellington or Auckland. But for me, it was that explosion. And I remember Don't Fight It, Marsha being on the radio in my flat in Wellington and me going, wow, what is this amazing song? And there were songs by you guys. It was just an incredible year for music. So we're looking forward to doing 1981 in Westside because we're about to feature some of those. So that's kind of interesting. But again, it's a great chance for us to explore changing social attitudes in 1981. It was a year of huge change, I think.
And as you were saying before downstairs, there's probably another 20 songs we could have put on that list.
Yeah.
There are so many songs from that year.
So what was it? Was it the social turmoil and the tour and
Well, the tour was a big
everything
part
else?
of it, but there were other things before. There was the Bastion Point thing.
Yeah.
There was the punk explosion where people started writing their own songs. All of a sudden, you weren't limited.
Plus, it was also not that long before they had Carless Days and.
Well, that was 79.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
you had to,
Sort of
you'd be on tour, and you'd have to go and do deals with farmers just to get gas to put in your van or your truck to carry on further, and you'd
Is that how you toured?
Honestly, logistically, it was a nightmare. No mobile phones, of course, so you
But
had to get to where you were going.
It might have been just my
However.
age, but it also did seem to be an explosion in touring. I mean, the
There was.
bands just moved around.
Well, there was a
a
whole
lot.
touring circuit that was put in place by...
That was great. The house bars were just really alive because you'd get the Penlife glides over here and you'd get
Yeah.
so-and-so over there and you'd
And
all
they
meet
gave you a
up in
guarantee
town
too, so you got
after your
paid.
gigs.
You turn up in a town, you had a guaranteed amount of money, so it was viable to get in a van and go around the country. The other thing about that list of Silver Scroll things is, apart from maybe the Split Ends, which kind of probably wasn't really eligible back then.
Oh, come on.
Well, I'm just talking...
Yeah.
But none of those songs would have been nominated if there had been a Silver Scroll in 1981. It's all changed so much. That's,
So they were the top 5. They were the most
but
popular?
what was being nominated in those days was far more conservative.
Yeah.
I'm kind of thinking maybe it was the year they just didn't bother.
No, the Silver Scrolls then were held in August.
Oh.
What happened in August? The Springboks arrived.
Ah, of course. Right.
Yeah.
Well, that would explain a lot.
Yeah.
Because the Silver Scrolls used to be a 20-minute ceremony in the foyer of whatever hotel was available with club sandwiches.
Or in Phil Warren's nightclub.
Yeah. And now it's turned into this huge extravaganza with sponsors and, amazing.
Yeah,
So-
I must say I'm looking forward to the 50th
Yeah, so am I,
anniversary
yeah,
run. I
very
think it's
much
going to
so.
be amazing.
Who's going to win? Going to call it?
No. No, I think both...
What about
both,
you, Dave? What do you think?
Oh, I don't know. I think I think Tally Ho would be a pretty good.
Tally Ho's the one in my heart, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to move on from rock and roll, which we've talked about quite a lot, to the other thing that happened in 1981. And Simon, I'll go to you first on this. Modern Auckland Clubland was born in 1981 at a room in a crappy hotel on the corner of Wellesley and Albert Streets called A Certain Bar.
With a guy that Dave knows called Peter Ehrlich.
Yeah.
Yeah, who was in Dave's
great.
band.
That was fantastic.
So it all kind of ties together. Auckland's very small, of course. And Peter, after the dudes had broken up, Peter went to the UK and started hanging out with some interesting people in the UK, and he started going to clubs, and the whole punk thing kind of changed. The post-punk thing had got very rhythmic in the UK.
Yeah.
And Peter had immersed himself quite a bit in that, and he came back and he found a guy called Mark Phillips who was working at Rip It Up, and they said, let's do a nightclub. So they went to this little bar, which was empty. There was a bar on the corner, as you said, corner of Wellesley and Albert. And they walked up there on a Friday night, and there was one man and a dog in there, basically. So they went up to the bar manager and said, look, we can fill this place next week. And the bar manager said, well, yeah, sure. But what have I got to lose? I'll give you a week. And within 2 weeks, they had the place absolutely rammed.
What year is this?
1981.
When did you come into Clubland?
Me.
Yeah.
I think when I was 15 was when I first tried to get in. By 16 I was in, so it was not long.
6-month club, right?
Well, it was 6-month club is where in Cook Street, which is always the place I could never get into. So I was actually beaten up by the bouncers there once for trying to sneak in. But it was all. When you hear about clubs back then, it's the legendary thing is it's because it was so exciting and new and no one had ever done it before, and it was also real because in Clubland now people just go out. It's not really a destination thing like back in the days when bands were playing. You'd make I'm going to go see that band. Clubs not really like that now. Not really. Like they put us on as headliners, but people would just turn up. It was different back then because the big difference between clubs now and then is because of the records. So if you held the key to the records, which this man here had for most of his life, that was the key. Because he had the records. We didn't have them and we had no way of getting them. So that was the key. So you would go to those clubs to hear records and you would just, it was unbelievable.
Yeah, there was that thing. It was a scarcity economy. It was the same as NME. And I think the two big moves on, your clubs came after you spent 2 years in London and came back with a pile of records. Same deal with Peter Ehrlich.
There were a couple of clubs that tried to get off the ground. There was a musicians club in Fort Street that the Androids tried to get happening, which was rather interesting.
It was a very interesting place.
This is going to be a really good idea. We can come after our gigs and just hang out with everyone in town, Androids, whoever it was. So.
Would you put the Androids in charge of a nightclub?
And they were in charge of a nightclub. And I remember going in there for the first time when we sat down, ordered a beer and going, oh, this is nice, this is civilised, great. We'll have some nibbly food, very nice indeed. Oh, beautiful, it's not crowded, it's lovely. All of a sudden, hut. They came in through the windows, down on ropes and stuff. It was a raid, an incredible raid, and it was like the riot squad had turned up to bust the place. And there was this enormous kerfuffle. And we just ended up cracking up laughing, and they threatened to throw us all in jail and everything, and it was very, very difficult for any place to get a license back then, So for you guys to actually get a license, to get a license and be able to act freely.
So you got a license by going to some place that was already licensed.
Yeah.
And you said to them, we can fill your venue.
Yeah.
That's how you did it.
And can we do this and can we do that?
Because licenses are very expensive to get.
Well, you need fire extinguishers and ramps for this and all that stuff, so you'd have to spend a fortune to try.
There was a woman from the
the
Auckland City Council called Merle, and Merle, everyone was terrified of Merle. She had to walk down the stairs and say, "You're closed."
Hey,
police.
One other thing that happened around that time, because I was new to going out in the city, but the city was actually quite dangerous. It wasn't much fun, and there was this infamous shooting outside Main Street back in the days, which actually is a cousin of ours. She's a Chase. She was a cousin of ours.
Margaret Bell.
Yeah, and that was because I'm Philip Bell, and she was part of our extended family. Not long after that, it was just not a good feeling to be out in the city at like live venues, because I was it's one of my lowest moments, but I was a roadie for Stonehenge. Do you remember Stonehenge? They're a really terrible metal band from Hamilton. Really bad. So
You made that up.
I swear on my
they
kids.
existed.
Did you have
I swear
statues
on my
about this
kids.
big? Did you have
I swear on my kids, this is a true story.
Dancing
and then
dwarfs?
I was like moving their gear around, and then they left and just left me there. Just totally left me in Queen Street. And I remember thinking, this is really unsafe. The city wasn't much fun. However, when the clubs were, everyone was in a relatively good mood. So when you went to the clubs, you felt relatively okay about where you were at the time, and people were happy as opposed to gigs which, you know, you could kind of go either way. So that was a really big part of Clubland as well. Because when I used to go out to live venues, it's like, this doesn't, you know, I was from Papakura, so I was kind of smartish, but it was just like, there's really big, bad people in town. Go to clubs, it was kind of like, oh, let's have some fun, let's dance all night. And then you could literally, we talked about this before, dance all the way till the first bus at 6 a.m, and that's cool. You know, that was kind of safe. If someone come up, we're like, that's okay, you know.
And this actually might be quite a good time to acknowledge the Auckland gay community because, as I recall it, Alfie's was the only place.
Fantastic.
Everyone went to Alfie's.
Great gig.
Thank you, the gays, because they were the only ones who could actually keep it together, and they got a nightclub
They
license.
had no ID check there, though. That was the big thing about Alfie's. You could get in there when there's 15, 16, straight in the door. Straight up, man. Everyone went to Alfie's.
That's true. That's absolutely true, yeah. Absolutely true.
They go, oh, no, you're okay, let's go, let's go.
Simon, we'll leap forward in time another couple of years because Alfie's was on High Street, and that's where your best-known clubs were, the Siren, which became called Celeb, and then the Box. And in the book, the How Bizarre book, which is very good, I've read it. I read it all in one day. You clearly regard that High Street quadrant as quite special. What happened there as quite special? What was special about it?
It was kind of a hothouse, I suppose. It wasn't just what we were doing. There was myself, just to clarify too, the clubs were me and Tom Sampson. There were two. It wasn't just me. But around that precinct, there were about 4 or 5 other venues as well. And on a Friday and a Saturday night, High Street would turn into this hive of, it just buzzed and heaved, basically. Remember, Philip, it was just incredible.
Amazing. It was good fun.
And there were musicians and people, and you know, it was insane. And cars had trouble getting up and down the streets. The police were very, very tolerant of what was going on because there was very little trouble. And each club had this little scene going on. There was live music happening, there were DJs, and they all fed off each other. So down at Cause Celeb, for example, we'd have Nathan Haynes playing, the Fuimana family playing, Manuel Bundy would be DJing next door, and Greg Churchill. You know, the range of talent that was coming out of these places was extraordinary. And because it buzzed and because there was money going around, it was all very, very viable as well. So I think it was also kind of important because it was the time when the new generation of young Polynesians came to town. And there was that big immigration, as we all know, in the 50s, 60s and 70s from the islands. And the children of those people that had immigrated in those years grew up, and they all came to town, and they changed the way we entertained ourselves. They changed what we listened to. They changed the way we dressed. It was a major revolution.
What was your experience at that time, Phil?
By this point, I was getting into clubs legally.
Actually, I have to say a point that Simon makes in the book is that one thing about their clubs was there was no colour bar, where there were still a lot of places where brown guys wouldn't have been welcome. Was that your experience?
Yeah, it was just all in. It depends when you look at it. There was this point in time where the playground on Nelson Street, that to me was the greatest, that moment in time was the greatest club moment ever, because it was really funny because you walk into it and like everyone you knew from all walks of life were in the same place at the same time. Plus, there was no music policy. And Roger Perry, by the way, who I consider probably the greatest New Zealand DJ ever, who was playing Simon's records. He just was playing anything. You can't do that now. It's been 15 years since you could do that. So the melting pot that it was really creative for a start. Like the Nathan Haynes thing was amazing. I kind of feel like Nathan made it okay to go there. he was like, it's okay to come hang out with these people. Because to be fair, you know, we're just a bunch of idiots from South Auckland who would drive into town and party, and then we like really had no place hanging out with those people. But it was okay because it was a cool environment. So I kind of feel like Nathan Haynes was a big gatekeeper, and Roger played just the right music. It was, you know, they talk about the golden years for Clubland. That was it for
Were
me.
you aware of what Simon's talked about as, of those brown kids coming in from the south and the west and reshaping the culture?
We had no idea that was happening because I was one of those kids, but
right.
we didn't know.
You're in the middle of it, right?
We didn't. It wasn't. We just thought it was awesome because it was fun, man. It's just like when you talk about Parnell back in the days, it was fun. It wasn't. Let's go and change the world.
Let's
let's
do culture.
and meet girls. That was.
And there were no colour bars. There was no. The only sort of bar was, do you understand? If you understood, you were in, basically, and that was it. I think that applied not only to us, but all the other clubs around the area. If you fitted in, didn't matter if you were wearing jeans or wearing whatever you wore. I mean, people would turn up on our door dressed in, you know, very expensive suits, and we'd say, no, you can't come in. Then some guy walked past in a baseball cap and a pair of dirty old jeans, and they couldn't understand it.
Yeah, because there was that point of difference where there was a little bit of intelligence as to, you know, how you vetted people. If somebody was
We had fantastic
obviously a
doormen.
bit trolleyed and looked like they might cause trouble, then, you know, bugger off. And it didn't matter whether they were in jandals or a Marnie suit.
Now, Dave,
Yes.
I've got the 10-minute signal, and we're going to go 15 because there's a bit more to talk about. I have to ask you about something less happy. And the reason I'm going to ask you about the Aotearoa Square riot,
Right.
for which you were unfairly blamed, and not only blamed but charged, unfortunately eventually acquitted. What really struck me about that was I actually wrote 2 articles about that for AudioCulture, and
Yes.
I just put out the appeal on social media for people's stories, and it became evident that everyone had a story.
Yes.
And some of them were extraordinary, and people still, you know, although it was a dark day for Auckland, a lot of people had a very good time, you know, in retrospect.
Yeah, in retrospect, but there were a lot of people hurt as well. You
Yeah.
know, and that, I think that affected me pretty deeply eventually.
How did that make you feel about being in New Zealand? Did you feel exiled for a while?
Yes, well, I was living in Australia at the time, so I came back, and in fact, I had about 3 or 4 players from Australia. It was their first experience of New Zealand. It was that gig, and none of them have been back. Apart from the saxophone player who married a Kiwi, and he's very happy here, a guy called Mark Dennison. Anyway, yeah, it was a very difficult time, but I think the only thing I should have been arrested for and charged with was my sartorial choice on the day. Basically, I was very good at that in the 80s, wearing terrible clothes. So I should have been charged for that. But the other thing I shouldn't have been charged for, but thanks to the Heinemann Dictionary, the second definition of the word wanker was a foolish person. And that basically got me acquitted, because that's what I called the police. Because from where I was standing, and there are a lot of stories, and thank God a lot of the documentation of that night or that day, there was corroborating evidence from various sources that it was just out of hand right from the word go. FM radio had just started, 89 FM, decided to throw the concert on Sans Security on a Friday afternoon when school had finished on the 7th of December, 1983?
4.
I was charged with inciting a riot, or to continue a riot. And I was staying at the Debrett's at the time, which is a wonderful pub opposite Alfie's, and had the presence of mind after escaping the debacle to check into another hotel out at Logan Campbell. And anyway, Mr. Plod eventually caught up and came and interviewed me, wanting me to sign a piece of paper saying, oh, look, it'll be a $125 fine or something. And I said, no, I can't say anything without a lawyer. consequently hired the late Sir Peter Williams QC at great expense, but also it was exactly the right thing to do. And the prosecutor was none other than Mr. Morris. So the old team that fought over Aotearoa and Thomas were fighting on my behalf and against me in the court with Judge Joe Brown, RIP, as the magistrate, who gave me a deep telling off, but I was acquitted. And it cost me a lot of money and a lot of gigs and a lot of heartache, and it still irks me to some degree in that, you know, in hindsight, yeah, of course I'm sorry for what I said, but the crowd was being attacked from behind by a bunch of half-boozed riot squad cops who were, you know, clearly making the wrong decisions. They turned the power off. Mrs. Tizard was crying under her desk. David Longley was coming through on his way to a split ends party in Albany for their final farewell, which went on for years afterwards. So we spoilt that party. And Muldoon had just been turfed out, thank God. So it was a very volatile time, and I think there would have been a riot regardless, even without a concert. The country was so upset. It was only 3 years since the South African, you know, the rugby riots, and it had sunk in to the whole country that we are a divided community, and we'd suffered so long under Muldoon, and the country was in a state of deep cultural poverty and angst. So something had to blow. So it was a tipping point. And you get all those stories like you did very cleverly in AudioCulture, which you republished from your original stories, and it's a very accurate thing. My only regret is that people got hurt. I learned a lot about justice and the language of courts and lies and, you know, made up facts and police corruption indeed. 15 years later, I had the great pleasure, I won't go on too long, I had the great pleasure of introducing it at the WOMAD that they had in Aotearoa Square one time. They had a WOMAD at Aotearoa Square, and one of the people on the bill was the charming, one of my heroes, Ernest Ranglin, Mr. Scar Guitar. So I had the pleasure of introducing him to the crowd. In the audience that day, that afternoon, there were 15 cops in the audience, and their job was to keep an eye on me. And it was 15 years later, and they were so conspicuous in their vinyl car coats and their stupid moustaches. They were as conspicuous as a bunch of cougars among pigeons, you know. And I'll never forget that. But I learned a lot of lessons, and in hindsight, I hold absolutely no bitterness. I'm only sorry that it happened, and that somehow, because my father was still alive, and my parents were deeply shamed by the thing, and I'm just sad that that there was no presence of mind, civic presence of mind as to what was occurring that day. And I think what's been written since is very interesting, and I think it had as much to say culturally and politically as the 1951 waterfront riot did. And I'm not inflating my own participation in the whole thing. I just think it's a very big turning point. That was a huge turning point in New Zealand's perceptions of themselves, because the reality of what had happened with the South African rugby tour had sunk in. We were a deeply fecked up country, and that was a very symptomatic change, and one which will, you know, entertain a lot of lawyers for quite a long time.
Hey, I was just on that. I was there that day. I was record shopping downtown, and I moved up to Aotearoa Square about half an hour before it happened. And you know what? It was going to happen anyway.
It was.
It was going to happen anyway, and it was terrifying, man. So as a relatively young man, I was pinned up against where the theatres were on Queen Street, and it was absolutely terrifying, man. But people wanted to riot. They wanted to, man. It was going to happen anyway.
And they said, what do we do in a riot? We turn a car upside down and we set fire to it.
And then you run at the cops and you
and
run away
that's
from
only
them.
because they'd seen it on the telly. You know, it was all that, and the mob mentality. I mean, I had a guy, the Australian guy, and he had a Super 8 camera, and he was filming people on the stage. I said, "Get the feck off the stage! You're going to get killed," you know. Yep. And we were in a caravan behind the stage. The cops had turned the power off. I'm shouting at these cops, "You stupid people! You turned the power off. That's the worst thing you could have done." And they were all set to take me up to the station. Jumped into a van, hit the floor, and we're driving in this transit van to get out of there. There was glass all over the road. We were all praying that the tyres wouldn't blow. Got out of there, checked into a Logan Campbell motel, turned the telly on, and watched it all. Again, feeling somehow guilty, but everybody felt that way, you know, because we were all part of it. You know, it was horrifying. It was deeply horrifying. It was like a whirling dervish of evil, you know.
Right, I've gotten the wrap up now, but I'm just going to quickly get one more comment from each of you. Phil, just quickly, we might have thought, talking about that riot, we might have thought we'd gotten past the city being spooked by popular culture. 2 years ago, the American rapper KRS-One came here, was going to be playing at the Cloud. The police stopped them because, according to a senior policeman, rap tends to attract a certain group within society which causes problems for the community. That same rapper, that same weekend, came and gave a lecture here. Yeah. What's that say to you about the place of hip-hop culture?
It sounds like the same old story. They regurgitated over and over again. They probably said the same thing about punk music. They probably said the same thing about hip-hop when it came out. It's just a forever evolving door of...
I said the same thing about Johnny Devlin.
Pretty much.
Yeah, that's right.
Rock and roll. Yeah. Look, it seems to me whatever is popular with young kids could be dangerous to their health, so the powers that be try and shield them from it. Let's just say that I never agreed to any of those sort of terms and just enjoy what you want to enjoy, you know? As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Simon, the one thing we haven't discussed is the subject of your book, Paulie Fuemana, who presented as a tough guy, but emerges in the book as very vulnerable and fragile. Would he, in the more mature environment for that kind of music today, have fared better than he did then?
That's a very difficult question. I think Paulie's biggest problem was his paranoia, which went right back to his upbringing, his youth, and the whole societal thing he came out of. Maybe, I mean, the industry is far stronger now than it was back then. We were all learning. We had no idea. We were, you know, we were the first people to take a record overseas and have a hit record in America, and we were told you couldn't do it. So every single step we took was you know, into the abyss, basically. And I think probably Paulie, our relationships got very fractured along the way because of the fact that we were all trying to work out what the hell was going on. And you also took Paulie from Grays Avenue, he was in a council flat in Grays Avenue, and a year later he's on Letterman. And he's got millions of dollars flying at him, and he's, you know, Drew Barrymore's knocking on his hotel door. And all that sort of stuff. It was, for want of a better word, it's a mindfuck. It's very, very difficult. I mean, I look at Lord now, what's it going to do to her? I think she's probably better equipped than Paulie ever was.
She's way better equipped.
Yeah.
And Rachel, have you been taking notes for your next story?
Always.
And I think on that note we'll finish. It's not quite the end of the evening up here because, as I said before, Dave is going to play some songs for you. I'm really looking forward to that. But please, in the meantime, and just a reminder that afterwards you can go down and hear Phil play some records as well. It's been really enjoyable. I wish we had another hour to talk. These people have so many stories. Please thank them.